Hello, everyone. Welcome to Something to Talk About Live. My name is Liz Owen. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I am the Director of Communications for PFLAG National. Great to have you with us again for another conversation. As always, I am joined by my friend, the host of our show, my colleague, Jean Marie Nevada.
Liz Owen.
Jean Marie Nevada, first of all, happy belated birthday. Gotta say it on air.
Thank you. I turned 26 for the umpteenth time.
You don't look a day over umpteenth. So
thank you, the umpteenth. So it has been a very big week for us, Liz Owen. We launched our new commercial in partnership with Oreo, and if people haven't seen it, they totally need to see it. Will you be able to tell people about it?
Absolutely. So, yeah, we have been, now this is our third year of partnership with Oreo. This year we've launched a Lifelong Ally campaign. And the new film is called The Note. It was directed by Alice Wu, who's another friend of PFLAG, and it is bring tissues. That's what I'll say. Bring tissues.
Yes.
But we're very grateful to them for their consistent partnership, and we love this movie. So go watch it.
Yeah, go watch it. Well, we have a good conversation, Liz, so maybe I'll see you later on.
Perhaps.
Thanks, Liz. Hey, everybody. My name is Jean Marie Nevada. My pronouns are she, or if you speak Spanish, ella. And I am the Director of Learning and Inclusion at PFLAG National. Every single week, we get together to talk about something related to LGBTQ equality and inclusion. And this week is no different. This week, we're going to be talking about data. And before you start rolling your eyes and you don't think it's exciting, or before you think it's a character in Star Trek, which it also is, but today that's not what we're doing. I want you to know this is going to be a really fascinating discussion because there's some really interesting stuff going on. So for those of you who are reading our article and want some discussion questions, this week's article is entitled "A Record Number of U.S. Adults Identify as LGBTQ. Gen Z is Driving the Increase." And that was in the Washington Post. And the author of that article was Julianne McShane. We actually do, if you go to the website, have a couple of extra articles for you, some phenomenal examples of why data collection is so important from the LGBT Cancer Network, and some great resources on data equity from the Movement Advancement Project. So let me tell you just a couple of the top line findings from this particular piece of research. So this year, a record 7.1% of U.S. adults self-identified as LGBT or something other than heterosexual. That was up from 2021's numbers, which put that number at 5.6%. So that's a pretty significant jump in a year of research. This year's record high includes 21% of Generation Zers, 10.5% of millennials, 4.2% of Generation X. We still are here. 2.6% of baby boomers, 0.8% of traditionalists, and 86.3% of people self-identified as straight or heterosexual. Now, those are interesting numbers in and of themselves, but it is what happens with this data and what this data can tell us and how it can fuel other work that needs to happen that is so interesting. And so as we do every week, we have some really smart people who are joining us. So today I'm going to introduce our two guests. First, I have Scout, who is the Executive Director of the LGBT Cancer Network. And we are also being joined by Naomi Goldberg, who is the Deputy Director of the Movement Advancement Project. And I'd like to welcome them in now. Hey, Scout. Hey, Naomi. How are you?
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us join.
I am so excited to talk to you both. And as previously mentioned, I'm going to do my best job to not start giggling and ruin everything today.
That would be horrific. So please do not subject us to any mirth whatsoever.
And it starts now. So before we get into the conversation, I knew you were going to be the instigator. I would love for you to both to tell people who are viewing a little bit about your organizations. And maybe Scout, you can go first, and then Naomi.
Okay, sounds good. So the National LGBTQ Cancer Network works to educate our own communities about our cancer disparities, how to reduce those risks, things like that. And then we also work to kind of change the systems and advocate within the systems to get them to do a better job of including us. Like only half of the NCI designated cancer centers even have LGBT non-discrimination on their website. That's a shame and needs to be changed. So that's the kind of stuff we do. And then we also work to train providers. We actually just released a massive the beginning of what's going to end up being an 8-part, 45-minute per module training about cultural competency, which is really cool that we just put out there. So those are kind of the examples of the area that we work in. We spend a lot of time on data collection, so excited to see this, or to talk about this. And with that, I'll pass it over to Naomi.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Scout. My name is Naomi, and I work for the Movement Advancement Project, and we're kind of a behind-the-scenes think tank in the LGBTQ movement, and we do 3 big things. One is we advance the conversation through messaging research about how to talk about LGBTQ people and LGBTQ issues in ways that drive equality. We advance policy, and that includes data inclusion. And in that work, we often work with the name brand organizations that you know and love best, including PFLAG. And we also do policy research that includes our equality maps, where we track 50 or so state level laws and policies across all 50 states, DC, and the US territories, where you can look at particular issue areas, but you can also check out your own state and see where your state falls in terms of LGBTQ issues.
Thank you both. And if you've never visited either one of these organizations, I really recommend that you do. There is so much good information, and both of them are kind of my go-tos for a lot of information. So I want to get into today's conversation because I was really excited when I saw these numbers, and then I saw a whole bunch of conjecture about why we were seeing these numbers and what was going on. So the article actually suggests that one of the reasons there was such a statistical jump in the number of people who were identifying as LGBTQ were cultural acceptance and policy and law changes, that it made people more likely to respond. So maybe, Scout, we can start with you. Do you think that it's an accurate assessment? Is that the reason we are seeing greater numbers, or is there something missing from this that would explain the jump that we're seeing?
Well, I do think that this is using the best science that we have. So this is as close to accurate as we're able to currently get right now. But that said, I think what's really interesting about what this highlights is, as I'm sure, a lot of the viewers here know, we're in the middle of a historic, never before seen in our life level of legislative attack on LGBTQI issues, right? And yet at the same time, we see more and more people coming out. We do think that that means those people are more comfortable, feel more safe. So it is kind of showing in some ways the dichotomy between those attacks, which may be loud and may be, scary and are certainly unnerving. And we certainly worry about what they mean for the youth who aren't really attached to a community of supporters yet, right? But the difference between that and where the actual population is going is really getting farther and farther apart. So I love to see this. And as I often say, as soon as this came out, I did the algebra. By 2079, our population should be majority queer if it continues at this rate of acceleration. So I need to take some big vitamins so I can stay alive that long, because that's going to be a fun year.
Thank you, Naomi. What's your perspective on this? Are you seeing things the same way, or is there stuff you'd add to the conversation?
I mean, I definitely think we can talk about the sort of increased cultural acceptance, the legal equality, but I also think when you dig into the Gallup data, you see that the increases are really being driven by younger populations, and they're a growing share of the overall US population. So when you look at this data, for example, in 2017, about 10% of Gen Zers identified as LGBTQ, up to 21%, just 5 years later. Whereas the trend line, when you look at traditionalists or even baby boomers, there's not that big increase. So definitely we know that part of what's happening is that there's shifting ideas and understanding of sexuality, of attraction, of behavior, and a sort of shift in understanding of what that means and how people identify over the course of their lives. And so I feel really excited by these numbers, both the overall percentage that's shifting, but also what we're seeing among the younger generations, because I think it really speaks to this idea that people understand sexuality as a spectrum. They understand people are attracted to different people and that that's okay. And so we're seeing them coming out earlier, but also changing the way we're all thinking about sexual orientation and gender identity.
Yeah, I was actually in a conversation with a PFLAG parent who was kind of talking about how the youngest generation actually has even made her question how she sees herself and her attraction. And in the course of this very live conversation, she pretty much conceded, maybe I'm not completely straight. And I thought it was so unbelievable that it was just this idea of nothing needs to be persistent. It can be, different over the course of a lifetime. It's fascinating. So one of the things that I've learned, and very much from people like both of you, as I've watched the work that's happened, is how questions are asked and the options given to people when surveys like this happen is really important. And this particular survey allowed people to actually identify with more than one identity. And that has been a problem in past surveys where, for example, you had to choose being lesbian or trans and not perhaps both of those things at the same time. So Scout, can we talk a little bit from your perspective? What are some of the issues when it comes to how questions are asked when we're looking for information on sexual orientation and gender identity? And is what we're seeing in this particular survey an improvement, or is there still room for improvement on this?
Definitely a huge room for improvement. Yeah, it is interesting because I used to joke long ago as we worked in this kind of data advocacy world for so long that by the time we got like the best question for LGBT, no one would be using the words anymore. And it was less funny as time went on, and suddenly, new identities did start to flourish, and you're kind of like, oh, we could really be in a similar situation, right? So, I mean, one of the things we really know is that, for example, identification as non-binary is going through the roof right now. There's a huge number of youth who are feeling the freedom and the safety to be able to explore that, identify as that. Also, there's a greater number of people identifying as asexual, which, you think about it, for any young person is probably amazing. The idea that we didn't have an asexual option, at the time, that especially for a lot of queers, any idea of sexuality was potentially a nightmare and potentially incredibly dangerous. So now it's like, oh, we've got something that is an affinity area you can lean into and be comfortable in, and just shut that off. Maybe forever, have it be off, or maybe at some point in your life, who knows? But the point is, it's your choice. So we love, as we do a lot of training, we always love the idea of the proliferation of these labels, because it means that fewer of us feel like we're like a lone zebra on the Serengeti with no other zebras at all, and instead lions around us, right? So we all want to feel like we're part of a herd. For youth especially, that is so much a part of safety. So as we get these more specific labels, like, demigirl, things like that, that means that people feel like they're part of a herd instead of alone. So that's beautiful. But on the other half of the equation, now putting on, like the survey designer's hat, and we've worked with survey designers and done cognitive testing ourselves for a long time, it's a nightmare. And, and trust me, as Naomi and we talk with these feds all the time, they're just like, I'm sorry, what? What are people identifying as? What does that mean? Do I have to put it on? Do I not have to put it on? And so really kind of what we're saying to everybody is, yes, these measures are absolutely going to get better. Right now, we have way too little research specifically on non-binary, actually, because a lot of the current adult measures are honestly like grandparent measures. They were tested by people a while ago, and the testing hasn't caught up with the newer identity labels. But as we say, measure what you have with whatever you can do as your best measure now, and then leave room for that future evolution, because lots of these are baby words, and in the history of word development, they breathe, they flex, they expand, they refine, they kind of like boil down. So as much as we love to see the proliferation because it's safety and security for people, from a survey designer's perspective, it's a hot mess, unfortunately.
I remember I was looking at a briefing for HRC data on youth and how they identify. This was several years ago, and I think the researcher said they had something like 35 different terms that young people use to describe their gender identity alone, because they had left it sort of as an open field. And while that was really celebrated, and oh my goodness, look at all this new stuff, as a data collection point, it became really challenging. Naomi, what do you think about this, about how the questions are being asked? And are there questions that should be asked that are not being asked right now?
Yeah, those are great questions. And I think there's a real tension here between the surveys that we're talking about, like this Gallup survey, or like a survey like the American Community Survey or the census that happens every 10 years, versus community-based surveys. And we really have to be thinking about, who are we trying to survey and what do they understand? And so this is where I sort of get a little nerdy and start to think about, kind of measurement error. And if just 10% of straight cis people get these questions wrong, they have swamped our population on a general population survey where about 10% of people may identify as LGBTQ, or in this Gallup survey, 7%. So we have to be really mindful that they get the questions right, that they know what we're talking about. We know, and I think that's another thing, is that we want to make sure that people understand the question. What that does mean is that often we force LGBTQ people to exert some autonomy in deciding which category fits them best of the ones that are offered, right? To have 35 write-ins is going to be very challenging on a huge survey, of 300,000 households every year, and to expect that level of data disaggregation. And if we do that, then it's up to that research analyst to make the decision about what box to put you in. And I think particularly when we think about surveys as as power, how do we ourselves want to be identified on a survey? And there's power in checking the box, even if that isn't the word that you might use. So for example, you see in this Gallup survey, they don't actually include a queer option. Right. It's, lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. And we certainly know that queer is the word that, many folks would prefer, let alone the words that, Scout was mentioning around pansexual, asexual, different things. And so there's a real tension here. And I think that's where community-based surveys provide such a great playground for us to figure out what are those emerging trends? How do we think about that? And also when we think about different communities that we're surveying. So if it's a survey that's about youth, we want to make sure we're being far more expansive and allowing for far more options than a survey of the whole adult population like Gallup. I do want to just flag for a minute that we have not talked much about intersex questions, and those are questions that I think we are really needing to pull from, especially leading within our community, knowing there's so much overlap between people who are intersex and people who identify as sexual and gender minorities. Those questions are definitely in the research phases, but we definitely need to be thinking more about those questions. The last thing I'll mention is certainly when it comes to sexual orientation, we know there's behavior, there's attraction, and there's identity. And for the most part, we're focused on identity measures because that's the sort of external expression of identifying as part of a community, identifying as a member of the LGBT community on a form. But I also think we want to be thinking about, for different contexts, and especially Scout could probably talk more about this in health contexts, what might be really important is actually the behavior. Or in an attraction setting, when we think about sort of fluidity over the course of someone's lifetime, maybe that's the question that makes more sense. And so regardless of which question we choose, I think it's always important to say, well, why? And what are we trying to measure? And how can we do our very best in designing that question so that it gets at what we're trying to actually measure?
I think that comment about identity and behavior and attraction is so fascinating because it sort of didn't even occur to me, but you can get very, very different answers depending on it. I've noticed I work in a lot of corporations helping them with self-ID surveys. And more, I find people calling me and saying, hey, should we include asexual? Should we include intersex? Should we include this? I think a lot of what's coming out of our community has definitely made it more into mainstream conversations. And I think that's exciting. Having said that, I agree that people's understanding of the words does get a little tricky. So one of the pieces that I found interesting and some of my colleagues found interesting is that more than 6% of the participants in that particular Gallup survey said they didn't want to respond to questions about sexual orientation or gender identity. These are anonymous ostensibly. What do you think is behind it? And I'm going to see who wants to take a stab at that first.
I can take a little stab at it. We have done some specific testing around non-response, which is what that's called, on these measures. And the non-response on these measures is usually thrown out as maybe a reason why we shouldn't put them on a survey kind of thing, right? One of the reasons we shouldn't ask these questions. And trust me, we get lots of the reasons why you should never ask these questions on surveys. We have to kind of like wade through a jungle of objections kind of thing, right? And usually non-response, it's lower than non-response would be for income, like another question, for example. It's usually around the level of non-response for race kind of thing. 6% is a little higher than I would have guessed, and I've seen from some earlier surveys. So I actually think in that case, of course, we can only look at, like Gallup can look at, is there a particular profile of the non-respondents that might be different? Like, is it older people who maybe are non-responding? We sometimes understand, like a sexual orientation question, older people misinterpret it as, have you had sex recently with who kind of thing. So, we know there's some of these ways you can kind of accidentally get into the wrong place. So, if I was Gallup, I'd be really fascinated to see, is there any kind of a pattern among those non-respondents that may give us some clues? But barring that, my biggest hypothesis would be that, as we kind of talked about, people either might be potentially confused. Sometimes they're resistant because people have put in things like, I'm not any of that, I'm a patriot. And you're like, you could have said straight, because that's what I think you meant to answer. You know what I mean? Exactly. one person famously put in fireplug. That was really illustrative. But you could get these people who are belligerent non-responders too. So, we suspect there could be some element of that, some element of confusion, and possibly some element of questioning or concern about what they put down. Any one of those could be a piece of the equation. But you got to do more research to find out.
Naomi, anything to add on that one?
Yeah, I would just say the great news is we have more samples than just this Gallup survey. And so when we look at, for example, the household pulse survey, which was conducted by the US Census Bureau as a pandemic sort of innovative survey, they included a sex orientation and gender identity question in this most recent couple waves, which is incredibly exciting. It's the first time the Census Bureau has done that. And they are finding fairly low non-response rates to these questions on par with other questions. And the National Academies for Science, Engineering, and Medicine just put out a huge report about SOGI and intersex data collection. And they comment that the research consistently shows these questions can be asked, people will answer them, and therefore it's time to add them, and there's actual harm to not. So while I think it's notable, 6% here in Gallup, we do have lots of other surveys that show these questions work, and we shouldn't be too concerned about that.
Thank you. So we are seeing these numbers growing. And one of the points that we started with is we think that part of it is because there is greater acceptance, there is greater visibility. We are seeing these numbers growing at the same time, to the point that you made, Scout. We are seeing a rash of absolutely horrendous legislation burning through the states. And I know that at MAP, you're definitely monitoring a lot of what is happening there. When you see numbers like this, more people identifying as LGBT, I'm going to say LGBTQ and just be inclusive here. What do you think that could potentially mean for the political landscape looking forward? And Naomi, because again, MAP is very much monitoring both the laws as well as these numbers. Do you have any viewpoints on that?
I mean, I think those two things are not always unrelated, but what it speaks to me is the real gap between reality and the lawmakers in many parts of this country, that they are living in an alternate reality that is not the place where the majority of Americans are living. Because the majority of Americans, as we see this with this research and other research, know someone who is gay, lesbian, bisexual, and increasingly, many Americans know someone who is transgender and know them personally. And so I think what we see is really that lawmakers are using these issues as a culture war, that they're seeking to create division, that they're sort of appealing to a very far-right agenda that's very out of touch with the way that most people are living their lives, knowing and loving people who are LGBTQ. I think it's really unfortunate because what it shows is just this huge gap where we've got so many youth in particular and young adults who really do need supports, and they need, for example, inclusive curriculum, and they need curricula and books that reflect their realities and reflect their families. You know, I am a queer mom, for example, and the thought that my child couldn't talk about his family at school or read books at school that reflect our family too is really upsetting. And so I think that these are happening at the same time really speaks to the disconnect of lawmakers and how out of touch they are, but also the ways in which we all need to be talking more about the kinds of world that we want our young people to live in and how important diversity and conversations about diversity are, particularly around the school curriculum pieces.
Thank you. Scout, anything to add to that?
Well, there is a little bit of theorizing that this is specifically because people are kind of so unnerved at some of the ways that sexuality and gender identity is becoming a little unmoored from these traditional paradigms. So, if you think about it, we got a fair amount of sexism going on in our world. And as soon as people start to identify as non-binary, they're really messing with that. And, there's a lot of people where that's going to create a really bad reflexive action. And some of those people are in legislatures right now. So, this could be, the howling last cry of a dying animal as we, 10 years back, look back on this time when we're like, wasn't that quaint when they thought they could stop this wave, because it does seem like what we're seeing. And actually, as we do all our trainings, we lead with the Gallup stuff early, and we always put up like, this is what it is for the different generations. Look at it change. And then we now even say like, this is what it used to be like 4 years ago. Then this is what it was 2 years ago. Now look at it this year kind of thing. So, and then we put up a slide of a wave. And, we just basically say, if you're not at this point, wherever you are, if you're in health, if you're in the corporate world, if you're in education, if you're not addressing the particular disparities this population experiences, you are rapidly becoming your own grandparents. So it's just, you're becoming of a generation that's not keeping tabs with the world today. So, we may have 80 bills or 70 bills or something like that were introduced this year. Naomi knows the exact number, but we have hundreds of thousands of people who are kind of voting with their own identity labels in a very different way. It's going to be hard to act like that isn't here,
Yeah, I really do hope that you're right about it, because I think sometimes the optic that we're looking at right now, it does feel like a wave, but it feels like it's crashing at us, and that we're not part of it. Liz is telling us that we do have a great question to ask, but there's one question I wanted to get in before we go to that one, because we are always really focused on this, on giving people things to do. At various times, we have opportunities to fill out surveys, whether it is at work, whether it is census, whether it is something that we are just called on. Could both of you give some advice to parents, allies, and queer people themselves about when these opportunities come along, how can we encourage participation in them, and why is that so important? And maybe Naomi, we can start with you on that one and then go to Scout.
Sure. I mean, there are definitely opportunities at the federal level in terms of legislation that's been introduced and contacting your congresspeople to talk about the importance of data inclusion for LGBTQ people. I would also say that, if you're part of a community that's running a community needs assessment, for example, if United Way is running something, making sure that they're including these questions and having that kind of personal conversation with someone about why these questions are important to be asked. So there's definitely advocacy opportunities at all ends of the spectrum, but I think we have a really exciting opportunity with the Biden administration around data equity. So making sure that you're getting in touch with your congresspeople when surveys are coming out, making sure that you're participating and that you're talking about the importance of data. And I know Scout has lots of experience in data advocacy, so I'm going to ask him to take the second part.
Well, I will just say that, Naomi, you absolutely encapsulate. We got amazing opportunities in the federal level. And if people are used to talking to legislators, absolutely chime in on this one. But also on an everyday level, really the goal is to get LGBTQ data collection a part of every demographic battery, and to only do it if you also have safety in order to disclose, right? So those two things. But that means every one of us goes places where we see it not happening now. And so I think the real advocacy moment is ask why not. So if you walk into your doctor's office and there's nothing that says LGBTQ welcoming, why not? If you're not asking on EHR as well, why not? If you go to a CVS and get a COVID vaccine, why are you just asking gender assigned at birth, but not current gender identity? What's going wrong here? Like, there's just so many places whenever you fill out a survey, if they don't have LGBTQ and are also somehow conveying welcome, ask why not, because we need to get it changed. And then of course, if you are in the community and you see in the communities and you see a question that doesn't perfectly fit you, remember what Naomi said earlier. It's because we're actually usually speaking to the outsiders. If we even confuse, and you said 10 out of 100, if we even confuse 1 out of 100, trans data is destroyed. So we're usually speaking to the people who are, over there. If you think it's anywhere close to you, please just say, yes, I'm in the group.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask Liz to pop in. We have about 2.5 minutes left to get one more question in.
Yeah, we actually have a great question here from Jacqueline asking about how we collect data about kids and their parents while we're trying to keep them safe in states where public policies are targeting them. I think it's a timely question, especially after what happened today in Alabama.
YRBS is an anonymous survey that is done at the middle school and high school level. Currently, it's required that sexual orientation be collected on that survey, but not the gender identity be collected on that survey. So surveillance systems are anonymous surveys that are not connected with the parents, and it's a perfect place to get information like that. I know that we're literally looking at the YRBS today because we get some great information around youth smoking trends in our communities. So if we can encourage the YRBS, which is run by CDC, to make LGBTQI data collection mandatory at both the middle and high school levels, we'll get some amazing data out of that, full national level data, and parents will be no part of that equation.
Thank you. And thank you for answering our super quick question, but it was an important one. Naomi, Scout, Liz, thank you all so much. This was exciting. I said data's fun. Fun with numbers, people. Fun with numbers. Thank you for what you are doing. And please, please make sure that you are checking out their organizations. They are doing such important work in our community. Please come back and visit us again, too.
Thanks all. We really appreciate it. We count when you count us, right?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, that brings us to the end of another show. I have 15 seconds to go. Just a reminder, if you want to lead with love, you need to read with love. So please check out PFLAG's Read with Love program by visiting pflag.org/readwithlove to know how you can get activated and put books back on the shelves where they belong. We'll be back next week with a really, really good show. I'm so excited about it. Until then, we leave you the same way every single week. We remind you to run fast, laugh hard, and most of all, be kind. And please, if you haven't been vaccinated and boosted, do that. Don't shame people who still want to wear their masks. And we will be back next week with another episode of Something to Talk About Live. Have a good week, everybody.